So I wanted to start off by talking to you about adventure. That's obviously been such a key part of your life, notably some of your record-setting balloon expeditions. And I wanted to take you back to when all of a sudden you unexpectedly lose 2 full fuel tanks and climb perilously high. What could have happened if the balloon continued elevating, and what are you thinking at the time?
It wouldn't have been very pretty. If the balloon had just carried on going up, which it looked for a horrible moment that it was going to do, the capsule would have imploded, and I wouldn't have seen or got to know my grandchildren. So it's a strange thing when you embark on these wonderful adventures, trying to do something that mankind has and womankind has never managed to achieve before. You think, you thought of everything, but just because it hasn't been done before, there are things that go wrong that you never expected to go wrong, and then you just have to, do your best to deal with them. And on that particular crossing, when we were trying to be the first to cross the Pacific in a hot air balloon, on paper, when we lost the fuel tanks, it looked like we didn't have a chance to survive. The chances were, less than 1%. We needed a miracle to survive. We knew that we'd have to go at speeds of over 200 miles an hour, and a balloon had never been faster than 80 miles an hour at the very, very, very fastest, and that was when we did the Atlantic. We managed to fly it right into the core of the jet stream, the equivalent of being right in the middle of a river when you've thrown a stick in the river and you've got the absolute fastest stream. And I just suddenly saw the speedometer going, 100 miles, 110, 120, 130, 140, 150, 160, 170, 180, 200, 210, 220, 230. And we were in a balloon. We were traveling at 230 miles an hour. And at that speed, if we could keep up that speed, we had a chance of making land and a chance of survival. We were aiming for Los Angeles. We missed Los Angeles by nearly 2,500 miles. we ended up in the Arctic on a frozen lake, 800 miles from the nearest person. The only thing that saw us was an otter that came up and gave us a sniff and then just walked off. But we were the first to cross the Pacific in a hot air balloon, and we'd survived. So we'd lived to tell the tale.
Another moment, you hadn't slept for more than 24 hours, and your captain jumps off the capsule, going 100 feet down into the freezing ocean. Take it from there.
Our first balloon flight was to try to be the first people to cross the Atlantic in a hot air balloon, and Per had thrown an explosive bolt and had been worried that the cables were cut most of the way through, but not the whole way through. So he threw himself out of the capsule into the sea. And because his weight had gone, and he wasn't a light man, the balloon just soared back up into the air, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 feet through the clouds. And I was standing on top of the balloon as it went up. And I'd only just learned to fly a balloon 3 weeks before. And there was, my experienced balloonist was now no longer with me.
And you're in the biggest balloon
ever. We were in the biggest balloon ever flown, and I was in trouble. And I climbed back into the capsule, and I didn't think I had a lot of chance of survival. So I wrote a short note to Holly, Sam, and my wife, and telling them how much I loved them. And then I put my parachute on, put a life vest on, climbed back on top of the capsule, and prepared to jump. And I knew this was the last, few moments of my life. And to be a parachutist jumping into the North Sea where it's freezing cold. Never done a parachute jump into water before. I'd lost all communication with the outside world, so nobody knew where I was. And so the chances of survival were, very, very, very unlikely. And I was looking down at the clouds, and because I knew that the fuel was almost finished, but I knew I had about another 20 minutes of fuel on board. And I decided just to, before I jumped, just to have another 5 minutes of life. So I climbed back into the capsule, and I also wanted some thinking time. And as I was climbing back out of the capsule, I looked up and I saw the balloon, and I thought, screw it, I've got the biggest parachute in the whole world right above me. The balloon is the parachute. What on earth am I doing? And it sounds sort of simple thinking back at it now. But anyway, so I then got back into the capsule, and I just started burning and taking the balloon down towards the sea. About 100 feet before I hit the sea, I climbed back onto the top, and just before it hit the sea, I threw myself off the capsule, away from the capsule, and the capsule hit the water, and then the balloon, without my weight, soared back up to 10,000 feet, and there I was in the sea. But I am a lucky, a jammy bastard, as they say in England. I had arrived in the sea, and a military Navy helicopter exercise was going on at exactly that time. And one of those helicopters saw me jump. And within 4 or 5 minutes, there was a helicopter dropping a rope down to me to hold on to. And they yanked me to safety, and we then were able to go and rescue Per.
Tell about being almost docked next to a refueling ship for 7 hours. Meanwhile, your vessel's riding 50-foot waves.
Yeah, so we were trying to break the record for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic in a boat, and America held this beautiful trophy, the Hales Trophy, but called, and it was for the blue ribbon of the Atlantic, and we Esso had put a refueling ship halfway across the Atlantic, and somehow had made a mistake, and when they filled us up with fuel, half of it was water, half of it was fuel. And so when we turned the engine on, it just, clouds of smoke came out of the back of the engine. And while we were doing this, this massive big refueling boat was rising, we were rising. And we were being thoroughly ill, all of us, the smell and the stench of kerosene. But we had a brilliant engineer on board, and he used, the few filters we had left to filter out the water. And we then headed off towards the UK again. But he started to run out of filters. And Margaret Thatcher was in power in Britain at the time, so we contacted the Prime Minister. She scrambled a Nimrod. This Nimrod flew over us. The whole of Britain was sort of on the edge of their seats. So so it was it was something which everybody was participating in. This Nimrod flew over and parachuted more filters to us, and it was so exciting. And we, on the first occasion, we sank, as you do, and got rescued by a banana boat. And then on the second occasion, we were successful and brought the record back to Britain.
And governments aren't always as nice as Britain obviously was. What do you remember from having to once negotiate midair with the Chinese, and how that strangely then resulted in Virgin being granted rights to commercially fly to China?
So we were attempting to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. We'd done the Atlantic, we'd done the Pacific. To fly around the world in a hot air balloon was going to take about 18 days. We took off from Morocco, and we headed across the Mediterranean. We skirted Iraq, and as we were skirting Iraq, there were American planes coming in to bomb Iraq, and they were wishing us good luck, we were wishing them good luck, and we then carried on over Kazakhstan and some of the sort of the remote places. And then we got sucked into the Himalaya chain, and it was beautiful, but we were going where we weren't meant to go, and that was towards China. We hadn't got permission to fly over China, and we flew over Mount Everest, we flew over K2, and we were just marveling at the beauty. But the Chinese made it clear to us that if we came into Chinese territory, they would have to shoot us down. And so as we got closer and closer to China, I was getting on the phone, and, to everybody I knew in Hong Kong to ask them to, Cathay Pacific and, the British ambassador in China, and, asking them to try to intervene with the Chinese, and wasn't getting far. And then I rang up my secretary at the time, and I said, can you ring Downing Street so I can talk to Tony Blair? And she said, I don't have the number of Downing Street. And I was getting very tired by now, and I just said, dial 192 Directory Inquiries and ask please for the number of Downing Street. Anyway, I remember it distinctly. I don't like to behave like that, but anyway, I did. And anyway, then Tony Blair intervened, and finally the Chinese, just before we went into Chinese territory, they said that we had to get through Chinese territory quickly and get out of Chinese territory, and they wouldn't shoot us down. And the bizarre irony was that as we flew over Shanghai, I got another email from our airline saying, you won't believe this, but the Chinese authorities have just given Virgin Atlantic permission to fly to Shanghai. And we've been trying for years to get permission. So a few minutes ago, they were planning to shoot us down. Now, Virgin Atlantic had been given rights to fly to Shanghai. And I'm not sure whether it was coincidence or whether they'd taken pity on us and decided that actually it was quite an adventure after all.
So you've rightly said you don't want to risk your life for those sorts of adventures anymore. But what do you think the chance is you'll ever do anything like that again?
I can't resist saying yes. If there's a challenge that I'm going to regret sitting and watching somebody else doing on television and having said no myself. So, I think if the right challenge comes up, I will still jump in and say yes. The challenge that we are concentrating on right now is one that has been perhaps the biggest challenge of my life, and that is building a space line. And it's taken 10 years to get to where we are today. We are literally months away, I think, from the space line beginning operations, and we're months away from myself and and my grown-up kids going into space, and then we're months away from the sort of 750 people who've signed up, starting to go into space. So, it's tremendously exciting. It's been, we've had high moments, we've had tears. Rocket science is tough, but we've got the 700 best engineers in America working with us, and we're just going through the very, very, very final stages of the test program. So so that will be the culmination, I suppose, of years of doing adventures. The day that strap myself into a seat and head off on Virgin Galactic into space. And there's one moment in that journey where you go from 0 miles an hour to over 3,000 miles an hour in 7 seconds, and that's going to be some rush. And then when you actually go into space, the sudden hush from the roar of the engines to complete tranquility, and being able to unbuckle and float around, look out through these beautiful windows back at the Earth, and it's been a long time coming, but we all believe that we're just about there now.
Right, and that would obviously be the ultimate adventure, and you would have succeeded in creating the opportunity for private citizens to enter space, among many other things. Before we get into the details of that, I've read both of your books and loved them, the autobiography and then the new book, which talks about your more recent years. And one thing that was kind of interesting.
Losing My Virginity was the autobiography, and now Finding My Virginity is the update.
There you go.
I was in Russia last week, and they have no idea what Losing My Virginity or Finding My Virginity means, so I had to explain it all, but anyway.
Well, and you almost never even were able to get Virgin as the name of your company because you had to battle authorities back in the day.
Yeah, we had a really bizarre situation where the authorities decided the word virgin was rude, and for 3 or 4 years they wouldn't protect it. And in the end, I got the English dictionary out, and there it said, pure, untouched, unblemished, perfection. And so I wrote to them and said, this is the opposite of rude, and they finally caved in and let us register the brand.
But so in reading your books, you seem to have this keen ability to almost do whatever it takes to figure out how to make something happen. And some of the stories are particularly funny, and I wanted to bring some of them up and get you to recall them. The first of which being, tell about volunteering to your school's headmaster that you were seeing his daughter and then subsequently faking a suicide scare.
I was the only Protestant in a Catholic school. The positive thing about the school was that the headmaster's daughter adopted a boy every term, and I was adopted for this particular term, and it was all going swimmingly well. But one day I got caught climbing down the drain pipe from her window, and or from the house that she was the matron of, and the headmaster had me into his study, and he said, I want to know what you're up to. And I said, well, I can't tell you, sir. So I said, he said, well, I put you on your word of honor to tell me, and I was just going through a little bit of a religious stage. So well, something to do with your daughter, sir, and he exploded and told me I was expelled for even suggesting such a thing, and for some strange reason I wanted to finish the schooling. So that night I wrote a suicide note. I gave it to the one boy I knew would open it, and I said, hand this to the headmaster tomorrow morning. And then I started walking very slowly up to Lover's Leap. And fortunately, after a few hundred yards up the hill, all the lights of the house started going on, and then I could start seeing 100 boys running after me, and I started hurrying up a bit just to add to the excitement. Anyway, they rescued me just before I leapt, and they decided not to expel me, and he gave me a good thorough birching instead. So, I think I should have just accepted being expelled. It would have been a lot easier, but I think I still quite fancied the daughter.
Your first real business, student magazine, how would you go about using a company's competitors to get advertising?
Well, I was working out of the school phone box, and in those days, you had to put money into the phone box in order to keep the phone calls going. And early on, I put some money in, and I got cut off. So I rang up the operator, and I said, "Operator, I've been cut off," and I put some money in the box, and they went, "Oh, no problem, so we'll just put you through." I thought, well, that's good. And so I would keep ringing the operator and saying I've been cut off, and they would keep putting me through. So now I had my own secretary working for me, which was the British Telecom operator, and I wasn't paying for the phone calls. And then I sort of started to learn from trying to sell advertising in order to get the magazine going. I didn't have any money. I needed to sell £4,000 worth of advertising to cover the printing and the paper costs. I learned early on that if you said to Coke, that Pepsi, were interested in taking an ad, that they would jump in and say, oh, well, we better take an ad too. If you said to National Westminster Bank that Barclays were interested in taking an ad, then they would jump in. So I learnt the art of bull, as we call it in England, quite early on, and ended up having Pepsi and Coke because and the National Westminster Bank and Barclays, and managed to get enough advertising to pay for the printing in the paper of 50,000 magazines. And the headmaster said to me, you either stay at school and do your schoolwork, or you can leave the school and do your magazine. And so I said, just turning 16, and I'm off. Thank you very much. And I left school.
Why, when journalists would come to visit you to do stories on you, would you make the phones ring off the hook?
I would have people downstairs. The journalists would be doing interviews, and I mean, it was going to be a very dull interview unless I could get some excitement going. So my phone started ringing, and I was Mick Jagger on that phone. I don't know. Anyway, when you're building a company without any financial backing from scratch, you need to make it a little sexier than it really is. And in those early days, we just threw everything we could at trying to make it succeed.
So you get an interview with John Lennon. Explain why you ultimately hired a lawyer to threaten to sue, and what ended up happening. So Derek Taylor, who managed the Beatles, had promised us, after I'd done an interview with John Lennon and it had all gone very well, that for the first issue of the magazine, we'd have a John Lennon and Yoko Ono single on the front cover of the magazine. And so we had Alan Aldridge do beautiful artwork around it. We had 50,000 copies printed up, and they somehow forgot to do the single. So they decided, they said, well, we have an idea. So I turned up at Apple's headquarters, and John and Yoko were there, and Derek was there, and they played the record that they were going to give us. And then Yoko Ono burst into tears, and I said, well, what exactly is it? And they said, oh, it's the heartbeat of Yoko Ono's dead baby that had died, and that's all it was. It was just boom, 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 boom for 4 minutes, and I said, it's not really what we were expecting, and I suspect foolishly, decided not to go with it. I just think people might have felt a bit cheated, and we sent a couple of legal letters saying, could you please get us a proper record, and it wasn't forthcoming. And then I wrote to Derek Taylor and just said, look, we'll survive without it. And Derek wrote me a note saying, thanks, Richard. All everybody needs is love, and we called it a day. But we had to get rid of 50,000 magazines without that cover, and that set us back quite a lot at the time. Much later on in your career, you call up the Rolling Stones manager. What did he say to you that you almost took as a challenge? And it seemed like it was...
So Prince Rupert was the Rolling Stones manager. We had a record label at the time. And I've always wanted to sign the Rolling Stones. And their contract was available, and I can't remember the exact figure, but I mean, he said, right, if you can get me 6 million by Monday, I would seriously consider doing a deal with you. And he was only getting 3 million from other people. So this was on a Thursday. So I then flew off to Germany, to France, to Italy, to as many countries as I could over the weekend, getting pledges of money from all these different territories. And on the Monday, I rang him up and said, we have your 6 million. And what he did, which was fair enough, he just went to EMI and got them to increase their 3 million to 6 million. But But in the end, after a few years later, when their contract came up again, he took mercy on me, and by then, Virgin Records was the most successful independent record label in the world. We had, Janet Jackson, we had Culture Club and Genesis and Phil Collins, and anyway, it was really, really going great guns. And we signed the Rolling Stones, and it was a great turning point for the record company.
So the majority of your success up to that point had been in music with Virgin Records, and you've said before the easiest way to become a millionaire is to start as a billionaire and buy an airline. What do your partners say to you when you come to them with the idea to start your own airline, and when they realized you were actually serious?
Well, Simon Draper, who ran the record label with me, basically said that that if I went into the airline business, our friendship would have to end, and that we could no longer work together. Because he just thought he thought he should ring up and get the white coats to come and take me away and have me locked up, because what on earth is somebody who's in the entertainment business wanting to start an airline? I'd had a bad experience. I'd been trying to get to see my lovely lady in the Virgin Islands, and we'd been bumped by American Airlines. I was in Puerto Rico, and it was 6 o'clock one evening, and I was determined to get to see her. I was about 28 years old. I went to the back of the airport and I borrowed a blackboard. I hired a plane. I wrote as a joke, Virgin Airlines, one way, $39 to the BVI, and I went around all the people who'd been bumped with me, and I filled up my first plane. And when we got to the Virgin Islands that night, it was the next day I rang up Boeing and said, "Do you have any second-hand 747s for sale?" And this wonderful salesman called R.J. Wilson said we happen to have one, but whatever happens, he said, "Richard, change the name from Virgin, because nobody will think that an airline with the name Virgin will go the whole way." But anyway, we didn't listen to him on that. We did get the 747, and I think the reason I think my partners were wrong was traveling on airlines in those days was abysmal. I mean, they would dump a bit of cold chicken on your lap. There was no entertainment. The cabin crew didn't smile because they were treated so badly. The planes were old and run down. And so, bring somebody in from the entertainment world and liven it up and make it a wonderful experience. And
yeah, but I'm sure they're rightly thinking, what do you know about an airline? You're a music guy.
Yeah, and the head of British Airways, came out with a sort of caustic comment. Too young to fly, too old to rock and roll. They're never going to succeed. And
funny enough, though, soon enough you had them pretty concerned. What made you realize somebody was messing with your airline and starting to create problems for you?
So we had about 3 or 4 planes after 2 or 3 years, and British Airways launched what became famously known as the British Airways Dirty Tricks campaign. And it was a kneecapping job to try to put Virgin Atlantic out of business completely. And we learned about what they were up to from people who actually worked for British Airways, who were really embarrassed to be working for a company that behaved in this way. So, for instance, they would have a team of people behind locked doors at British Airways who would be ringing up our passengers, pretending to be from Virgin Atlantic, telling our passengers that the Virgin flight was delayed, and then switching them on to British Airways. They had people intercepting our passengers at the airport and switching them on to British Airways. They had teams of people going through my rubbish bins, and if there was a journalist that I'd talked to, they would be going through the journalist rubbish bins. They had people. We had a gay nightclub in London, and they would go through the rubbish bins there to see if they could find any needles or any signs of drugs, and then report it to the newspaper, and then they would be trying to disparage our finances and so on in the press. So, but fortunately, they denied all this.
What was the point in which you realized you had to take them to court?
The amount of rumors they were managing to get the press to write about was becoming very dangerous and very damaging. If the press write about an airline and say that it's on the verge of bankruptcy or something, it can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When they denied all this, we sued them for libel, and we ended up winning the largest libel damages in British history. It was Christmas time, so we distributed them to all our staff equally, and it became known as the British Airways Christmas bonus, and all our staff were very, very happy, and it was such a big reward against British Airways that it really did shut them up, and from then on, we've had lots of competition over the last 35 years, but it's been basically relatively fair competition, not the sort of dirty tricks sort of competition.
Lord King, who was the infamous head of British Airways, what did your interaction with him entail when you guys ran into each other after your victory in court?
He wasn't best pleased, and actually he ended up stepping down from British Airways.
Because of your victory, basically.
Because of our victory. And but I think what it illustrates is your reputation is all you have in life, and you just got to be very careful not to destroy that reputation, and by doing something that is verging on illegal. I mean, arguably was illegal.
You end up selling your music business for $1 billion in effort to fight off British Airways during their attack, while for a lot of money, very painful for you, not something you wanted to do. What's the likelihood, looking back, that you could have fought off British Airways without having sold the business, you think?
It's a good question, and I suspect we may have just got away with it, but it was a hell of a risk. And if we'd failed to get away with it, we could have brought both companies, our record company and our airline, crashing down. So by selling the record company, the jobs in the record company were secure. It still has the Virgin brand on it. It's still the most successful record label in Britain, and maybe even in the world at the moment. And all the jobs at the airline were secure as well. So I think it was the right decision. It gave us the financial muscle to not only combat British Airways, but also to move Virgin into a whole massive new areas, and Virgin became a sort of way of life brand and became very exciting as a result of us having the resources to do it.
What got you interested in space and allowing private citizens to travel to space to begin with?
A long time ago, just as perestroika was happening in Russia, I got a telephone call, and I was told that President Gorbachev was on the phone, who was president of Russia at the time, and he invited me to go up on a Russian spaceship, not for free, for something like $40 or $50 million. But nobody else had ever been, no private citizen had ever been to space, and I might have been able to just about pull that money together, but I felt it would be perceived as being a waste of money for one individual to go to space, and I felt that I could put that money to better use. So I said no. But it did get me thinking, and that was, why not spend that kind of money building our own space line one day? And I didn't do it right away. I waited to see whether the American government or the Chinese government or the Russian government, whether they would be interested in putting you or me or people watching this program into space. And it soon became apparent they had no interest in that whatsoever. And Yeah, so in the 1990s, I registered the name Virgin Galactic Airways. I'm an optimist, so I also registered the name Virgin Intergalactic Airways. And we went out looking for a genius who could build a spaceship for us. And we were lucky enough to come across Burt Rutar, who was that genius and is that genius. And he got building a spaceship for us.
Explain the significance of winning your first military contract.
We have Virgin Galactic, which is putting people into space. We also have Virgin Orbit,
right,
which is putting satellites into space. And Virgin Orbit has won quite a number of contracts recently, including Department of Defense contracts from the American government. And the exciting thing about that is it shows a faith in what the team at Virgin Orbit and Virgin Galactic are doing, to have such a reputable organization actually make an order from us.
What role do you see space playing in Earth's future?
I mean, space has already transformed how we do everything back here on Earth. So, whether it's your mobile phone or whether it's your iPad or all the way we communicate with each other, space is most likely playing a part in that. What we see Virgin Galactic as and Virgin Orbit as is a means to try to improve things back here on Earth. So there's 4 billion people who are not connected. If you're not connected, it's unlikely you're going to be able to start a business. It's difficult to get proper education for your children, health information. There's a whole lot of things that are going to hold you back. So one of the things that we're working on is a wonderful company called OneWeb that we're involved in to put a massive array of satellites around the Earth, maybe as many as 2,000 or 3,000 satellites to connect those 4 billion people who are not connected. And that's one of the sort of prime purposes of our spaceship company. Another area is point-to-point travel. When Concorde disappeared many years ago, it was the first time really that a breakthrough technology had just gone backwards. I mean, we don't have supersonic air travel anymore. Virgin Galactic is going to be one of the companies that are going to be there pushing supersonic air travel and creating supersonic air travel, and we'll be working with partners like Boom and others to bring that to the world again, and that's tremendously exciting.
How do you balance the desire to pursue extraordinary achievement with the inherent risk associated with that?
Test pilots are incredibly brave. Their job is to test a craft to its limits, to find out, all the sort of things that could potentially go wrong, which is very difficult to find out on the ground before it actually goes in the air. And test pilots can make a mistake because because they're again testing something for the first time. And we had the incredibly unfortunate incident, which where a test pilot did lose their life and where the program was set back, by nearly three years. But by pushing themselves to the limit, that particular incident will never happen again, and the program will be that much more inherently safe by the time we actually finally get passengers to fly. We had to ask ourselves after the accident, is it worth it? We asked the 750 people who'd signed up to go to space, did they feel we should push on? Almost with one voice, they said we should. We asked the 700 engineers that work for us, did they want to push on? With one voice, they said they did. And I think, most of the public, wanted us to push on. And, so we actually, took all the business in-house. We're using another company's test pilots. We're using another company to build the spaceship. Now, everything is in-house. We've got our own test pilots. We've got our own engineers. And we feel it's extremely unlikely that we'll have a repeat of what happened. But you can never be sure when you're going through a test a test program.
Safety obviously is so important to you. You know, when your train company had a crash many years ago that was solely the fault of the track, had nothing to do with the train company. The reason why so many lives were saved was because of the extreme measures you went in construction of the train and just, making it safe. So what's it like for you getting a call like that when there's been loss of life?
It's happened to me twice in my lifetime, and I've, and one of the positive things is we've got 3 airlines flying millions and millions of passengers for 35 years, and we've never had such a call. So it's happened, once when a train went off its tracks, and obviously with Virgin Galactic, and I mean, with Virgin Trains, I was in a cinema in Zermatt with my children, and this vibrating phone just kept going in my pocket. And generally speaking, I don't answer the phones, but there was just something about the consistency of the vibration that made me look at the phone. And the moment I knew that the train had come off the tracks, I knew that the first thing you've got to do as an owner of a company, whether it's your fault or not, is just get to the scene of the accident. And that's what I did. I drove through the night. I couldn't get a plane. The airport was closed, and got to the scene of the accident first thing in the morning. And there was an elderly lady that had been killed, and I went to the morgue to meet her children, and we all had a big hug, and then I went to meet the press in the field, and I think I think that anybody who runs a company, if there's a bad incident, the critical thing is confront it head on, and anybody who's affected by it, make sure that you're there to comfort them.
What would you say has been your biggest failure over the years, and what do you think you most learned from it?
I suspect the most notable failure has been not knocking Coca-Cola off their pedestal.
Virgin Cola?
Virgin Cola. We had a good try. For a year or two, it looked like we were going to take Coke for everything they had. We were outselling them in Britain, in all the retailers that we were stocked, and we were outselling Pepsi. I then got a bit too big for my boots, and I arrived in Times Square with a Sherman tank from Britain. I crushed all these Coca-Cola and Pepsi cans. Cola was flying everywhere. And I then turned our Sherman tank's turret onto the Coca-Cola sign in the middle of Times Square. Anyway, Coke didn't take that too kindly. And the next day in Atlanta headquarters, they got bagfuls of suitcases of money. They got a DC-10 on the runway at Atlanta. They filled it with SWAT teams. They arrived in England, and retailers suddenly became very wealthy, and all our Virgin Cola disappeared off the shelves. And they basically kneecapped.
For real?
Kneecapped us. Yeah.
I mean, it was that quick.
No, they kneecapped us. I mean, very, very systematically. And we did not know this was going on. I mean, I would ring up Tesco's and say, "What are you doing? You've taken Virgin Cola off all the shelves." And they would say, I don't know, they would come up with some excuse. But so it wasn't until about a year later that a lady arrived who announced to me that she was the new manager of Virgin Group at Lloyd's Bank, and we went out to dinner, and it turned out that she was the lady at Coke at the time who'd been in charge of the kneecapping exercise, and now she was my bank manager, and I wasn't sure whether to strangle her or not. But.
You said before, real leaders see opportunities where others only see challenges. Explain that.
I look at everything as an opportunity, so I'm positive about life generally, and I generally feel that you can find ways of solving problems and making things work. And I'm definitely a sort of glass, nearly full kind of person rather than a glass half full. So, I think out of being just a generally positive person, you can make positive things happen.
What do you think about during your decision-making process?
So if I come up with an idea for a new business, I don't bring in accounting firms to cost analyze it, because one accounting firm will say it's a good idea, another accounting firm will say it's a bad idea. So if I, for instance, had brought in an accounting firm to say, will Virgin Atlantic work when we started the airline, I'm sure they would have said no way. But what I knew was if I could create the kind of airline I'd want to fly on that was exceptionally better than any other airline flying, that it was likely that more money would come in the year than go, and I'd have money left over at the end of the year. And that turned out to be the case because people loved Virgin Atlantic. They went out of their way to fly it. The planes were full, and at the end of the year, we ended up getting our second 747, and the end of the next year, our third and fourth 747, and so it grew. So my whole attitude to life is, if you create a new business that's the best in its field, it's likely to survive. When we took on Coca-Cola, a can of cola, Virgin Cola, and a can of Coke, ours may taste a little bit better than theirs, but we're not exceptionally better, and therefore it was easy for them to, just their sheer might and their sheer market dominance, they could put us out of business. But when you got British Airways versus Virgin Atlantic, when they tried to put us out of business, Virgin Atlantic was a much better airline, so people didn't desert us in droves.
Explain how you learned the difference between net and gross.
So I'm dyslexic, and I was hopeless at school, which is one of the reasons I left school at 15. But I could never comprehend things like net or gross, and I would just ask people, is that good news or bad news? And it wasn't until I was 50 that I was in a board meeting, and one of the directors said, "Pop outside a minute. Richard, you just said, is that good news? Did you not realize whether that was your profit or your turnover?" And I said, all right, I admit it. So he said, well, look, here's a sheet of paper, and he penciled in the sheet of paper blue. Then he put a fishing net in the blue sea, and then he put some fish in the net, and he said, right, your profit at the end of the year, that's your net profit. The rest is your turnover. The sea as a whole, the fish are not in your net. And I went, hey presto, I know the difference between net and gross. And
how old were you then?
50. We had the biggest private group of companies in Europe, and I did not know the difference between net and gross. And so ever since then, I've been, net this, gross that. I've been name dropping the two words, but nobody seems to be that impressed because they all knew the answer anyway. And the other sad thing was, of course, I thought that net was gross was the profit, and I realized I was making much less money than I thought I was.
Yeah, right. How does your dyslexia affect you today?
I think being dyslexic, by and large, helps people, and I know that when kids who are maybe watching this program and they're struggling at school will not necessarily agree with me, but I mean the great thing about being a dyslexic is you concentrate on the things that you're good at, and you often excel at those things, and particularly as you get on later on in life. As a dyslexic, I had to become a good delegator very early on, so I had to surround myself with great people. Because I wasn't good at maths or something, I had to find people who were good at it. Most likely Virgin, who now employs 90,000 people, would not have been successful if I hadn't been dyslexic.
What about when you went skydiving?
Skydiving, different dyslexia comes out in different ways in different people, but I went skydiving for the first time, and the guys thought, I remember him saying to me, Richard, you don't need to go down with an instructor. You're a bit macho, and you can do it yourself. And little did he know that I was dyslexic. So I'm coming down on my own with two instructors either side of me, and the instructor on my right is going, as I'm doing this sort of maneuver, and the instructor on my left is shaking his head, and I decided to like the instructor on my right, and he was doing this, so I pulled the cord And it turned out that I pulled the cord that actually got rid of the parachute, not the one that opened the parachute, and that's not a great idea. And that was my dyslexia or whatever coming out in rather a bad way at a rather an unfortunate time.
What about when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, nobody had heard of the word dyslexia. It's a very strange word anyway for, to call dyslexics, because it's a really difficult word to understand. The people just thought I was thick or stupid at school. I got beaten regularly. It was a sort of English boarding school thing that they used to do. It was brutal. I mean, they would take. I was sent away to boarding school at 7.5. You were called into the headmaster's study in your pajamas. You had to take the pajama bottoms down, and you were often beaten till you bled. It was a very archaic system, which fortunately I think has been banned finally in Britain a few years ago.
In a story that's since become famous, you're 4 years old, near your grandparents' house, and your mom pushes you out of the car a mile away. Why?
Well, I suspect I was being a bit of a brat in the back of the car, but she also was the kind of mother that felt that we needed to stand on our own 2 feet. And so she would do things which most likely she would get arrested for today, and I got lost in the fields and ended up being rescued by a farmer.
She did claim she was honking her horn as it started to get dark.
Yeah, and I think I was trying to get my own back on her a bit as well. So I was, even at 4, I was thinking, damn you, I'm going to make you sweat.
How did you convince your parents to let you leave school at 16?
It took 3 walks around the lawn. So the first walk, my dad understandably said, you should really try to finish your education. The second way around the garden, when I said I really had decided I wanted to leave, he started to mellow. And on the third walk around the garden, he said, well, look, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 21, leaving, college, and at least you know what you want to do. Go and give it a go, and if it doesn't work out, we'll try to get you a formal education again. And they were very loving, very understanding parents, and it was great to have their support. I think it helped that I was so hopeless at school. So I suspect they also felt there was nothing much to lose by me doing something different.
How much do you think your mom, being an entrepreneur, helped get you interested in business? Maybe it did. I mean, she always was trying things. She never was successful at trying things, but she was always trying new things. And I'm sure that some of that must have rubbed off for me. What role would you say each of them played in your lives over the years?
My mother was the more sort of disciplinary. My dad was more overtly loving father. So I'll give you an example. We lived next to a sweet shop, and my dad used to leave his loose change in the top drawer in his bedroom. And myself, my sister, one day when I was about 6 or 7 and she was about 4 or 5, we climbed onto a chair and we took some money out of his top drawer. We went to the sweet shop next door and we bought this enormous pile of sweeties. And Mrs. Avenel rang up my dad and said, I think you ought to come to the sweet shop. So he turned up and she said, I think that, maybe your children have borrowed some money from you. And he looked at us and he looked at Mrs. Avenel and he just turned on her and said, how dare you accuse my children of stealing? He then left the sweets on the counter, took us by our hands and walked us home. Never said anything, and we never stole from him again. It was a very, very, very good lesson. On another occasion, my mother asked him to spank me, and he took me into the next door room, and he just clapped his hands very loudly, and told me to cry, and he gave me a bit of water, and I went running out and pretending to cry. So both of them were very loving anyway.
You were married once before your marriage to your current wife, Joan, of nearly 30 years.
40 years.
Of nearly 40 years. Before marrying Joan, you were thinking marriage was starting to become less appealing to you. Why?
Before marrying Joan, I had been married very briefly when I was very young, and she fell in love with a musician and went her own way, and I didn't really fancy the idea of being hurt again and getting married again. And so when Joan and I got together, we decided just to live in sin and have our children, not get married. And it wasn't until Holly was about 10 years old, I'd just come back from Los Angeles, and I turned to her and said, do you think Mum and I should get married? And she said, yeah, that's a lovely idea. And then she said, I'm not sure she'll have you. So I said, well, do you mind going and asking her? So anyway, she went and asked for me, and all was good.
But a key moment for you in that relationship seems to be you had just come home, Joan was gone, she'd left a note for you on the table, I believe telling you she was pregnant.
Yes, I came home one day and to find that she was pregnant and had left me, and just said if I want to see her again, to give her a ring. And
why'd she left you?
Because she wasn't sure whether I wanted children at the time, and she decided she did want to have children, and I wasn't necessarily ready for children. But so I sat down, thought about it for a few moments, and gave her a ring, and it couldn't have been a better. Men are terrible. We don't like to be tied down, to be honest, and sometimes it takes a woman to do the job for us.
What did you say on the phone?
We should have dinner. I can't remember what it was,
okay.
But no, I mean, look, it was absolutely fantastic, and has only been better every single day of our lives since, and it was. The best decision of our lives, so I'm very happy.
Given all your professional success and the constant travel associated with it, how challenging did it make it to be a present father when your kids were growing up?
Do you know, I would say that I've spent more time with my kids than most fathers I know, and the reason for that is I'm a great believer in delegation, and I'm a great believer in working from home. So we lived on a houseboat, and I worked on the houseboat. And the kids would literally be crawling around the floor. I might be changing their nappy, having a meeting. So I think I spent a lot more time with my kids than most fathers. And as a result, we're an unbelievably close family. And actually, I do try to encourage our companies to, be very flexible with people that work for the company, so they can if they want to work from home, they should be able to work from home. If they want to work from home on a Friday and a Monday, they should be able to do so. Not feel that they have to rigidly be in an office all the time.
Holly and Sam, your two grown kids now. What role do you see them playing, if any, long term in Virgin?
They're both wonderfully personable. They're great with people. Holly runs our foundation and runs it really well. Sam has got his own little film company. He's done wonderful films on the war, against the war on drugs, and breaking the taboo, and on trying to sort of campaign to stop the death penalty and other areas. One day, when I decide to move on, they will be very capable, I think, of together. Being a ambassador, being the two ambassadors for the Virgin Group, and I think companies benefit from having faces instead of just being faceless companies, having front people, and I think they can play that role really well.
Explain how teaching Queen Noor of Jordan's family to fly a hot air balloon uniquely positioned you to negotiate with Saddam Hussein for hostages.
So I got to know King Hussein and Queen Noor of Jordan through flying them in a hot air balloon over Amman, their capital city, with their children on board, and going across the chimney tops, and the people looking up at this balloon, and then just seeing their king and their queen and the princes waving down at them. It was quite a moment. And then Saddam Hussein was holding some hostages to try to avert the Allies invading him. And I wanted to try to see if we could, get these hostages out. And so I went and saw King Hussein at the Royal Palace, and I wrote a letter to Saddam Hussein and asked him if he could translate it for me, which he did. And he then sent a messenger to Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein responded and said, yes, if you're willing to come in one of your 747s to Baghdad, I will come to the airport. I will bring the ill hostages to the airport. If you could bring some medical supplies for Iraq, that would be wonderful. And 3 days later, we flew into Baghdad. It was an eerie, incredible experience. I mean, no plane had flown in for months and months. The lights went on at the last minute. And we met Saddam Hussein at the airport, and he handed over the hostages. And as we left Iraqi airspace, there was a almighty cheer. And when the second Iraq war looked like it was going to happen, I for one was vehemently against the idea of it. I thought it was a dreadful mistake, one of the worst mistakes since the invasion of Vietnam all those years ago. And because I got to know Saddam Hussein, briefly, I thought maybe I could try to persuade him to step down and go and live somewhere else in order to avoid the war.
And you've later reflected on this being the biggest regret of your life.
Yeah, ISIS came because of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, that it was the sacking of all those police and all the military, and giving them no hope after the successful invasion of Iraq that resulted in ISIS and all the other horrors that have gone on. The whole balance between Sunnis and Shiites has been ruined because of it. So we were trying to stop it. So we asked Saddam Hussein, would you be willing to entertain Nelson Mandela coming and seeing you? And the idea was that Nelson Mandela would arrive in Baghdad, would persuade Saddam Hussein to leave Baghdad to save his countrymen and to save an unnecessary war, and then go and live in somewhere like Libya for the rest of his life. I asked Mandela if he would go, and he said he would go if Kofi Annan, who was then Secretary General of the United Nations, would go with him. I asked Kofi Annan if he would come as well, and he agreed to go. And then sadly, a couple of days before they went, the bombing started and the meeting never took place. Who's to know whether how history might have been changed if that meeting had taken place. But one positive thing came out of it, and that was an idea that if these elders like Kofi Annan or Nelson Mandela could have such influence over somebody like Saddam Hussein, maybe we should get a group of elders together. And Peter Gabriel and myself set up with Nelson Mandela a group of global leaders who now go into conflict regions to try to resolve conflicts. And the elders started under Nelson Mandela's blessing, with his blessing. And then you had Archbishop Tutu running them. Now you have Kofi Annan running them. And it's just 12 incredible men and women who've got maybe the biggest moral authority in the world, the biggest respect in the world of any group of people. And they've done some fantastic work.
How about the most interesting conversation you ever had over the years with Nelson Mandela?
Anytime he came to lunch, he would try to hit you up for a lot of money for good causes, and he had lots of good causes. So I had lunch with him and Gracia Michel, his wife, and myself and my wife and children. And we got through the first course, the second course, the third course. We were on to the coffee, and I was thinking, I've got away with it. and then he turned to me and said, "Oh, Richard, by the way, last week I had lunch with Bill Gates, and he gave me $50 million for our half." Anyway, no, I mean, he was just an extraordinary man who was always thinking about other people. Yeah, somebody that I think the whole world has looked up to. And Archbishop Tutu has continued to carry the banner ever since with a lot of grace and good humor.
And you ended up rescuing a lot of South African health clubs that were in financial trouble thanks to
so he rang me up one day. I just got back from South Africa. He rang me up. I was in the bath, and he said, Richard, a chain of health clubs with 6,000 people working there is about to go bankrupt. I want you on the next plane down. I want you to come and rescue the health clubs. And I did get on the next plane, and we did rescue the health clubs. And actually, it's become one of our most successful businesses. And so now Virgin Active has, I don't know, over 200 health clubs in South Africa. So it's the kind of thing that he, as a president, not many presidents would ring up and think, he didn't even know that we had a couple of health clubs in England. Wouldn't ring up and say, come and rescue these jobs, and it was great.
Tell about the meal you once had with President Trump.
Well, it was the first time I'd met President Trump, and he wasn't president then. It was back in the 90s, and rang me up to invite me to his flat to have a meal. And I turned up, and there were just the two of us, and it was a fairly extraordinary lunch. He spent most of the lunch talking about his bankruptcy, his latest bankruptcy, and during the time he was sort of trying to save the company, he'd rung up a number of people and asked them for financial help, and how 5 people had said they wouldn't give him financial help. He then went on to say that his life's mission was going to be to destroy these 5 people. I've been brought up to look for the best in people, to forgive people who you feel have let you down, and in any event, I don't believe that these people had really let him down. They just said no when he'd asked for financial help when his companies were in trouble. So I said to him, I think it's going to eat you up. It'll won't do them any good, and it seems counterproductive. But he was going to have none of it, and so I left feeling quite, it was quite a strange lunch, because I was also quite baffled by why it was the main subject of discussion rather than, talking about something maybe a bit more worthwhile.
When you had a rival television show on an American network competing against his then show, The Apprentice, what did he write in the letter he sent you?
Well, our show wasn't really a rival, but although he seemed to think of it in a letter that he wrote me. Ours was more an adventure-based show, so I would take people to different countries and put them through, really extreme adventures. And but he wrote me a letter basically saying, first of all, the show shouldn't be called The Rebel Billionaire because I'm in the airline business and I couldn't possibly be worth $1 billion because people in the airline business, never make any money. And therefore, I should be effectively changing the name of the show to something like The Rebel Millionaire or something. I mean, anyway, it was just a rather a churlish letter. And so, in my new book, Finding My Virginity, I thought it would be interesting for people to see the correspondence and to tell one or two of these stories, because it shows. It shows quite a lot, I think, about the President of America at the moment.
What did he subsequently say when you next heard from him in 2015?
So in 2015, he wrote to me, congratulating us on Virgin Galactic, and very, very pleasant note. And
your impression of that was what?
I'm a great believer in making up and being friends with people you may have fallen out with in your life, and I think if it wasn't for the fact that he was running for presidency of America, I would have been delighted to have responded. And but I was slightly suspicious that he most likely was sending notes like that to lots of people because he was running to be president of America. But anyway, look, he's done extraordinarily well. But it's just, I think it's interesting for people to hear stories, and people can judge for themselves, based on stories like this.
Necker, your oasis of a private island in the Caribbean. How have you gone about building the island up over the years, and what's been involved with working to make Necker and the sister island you bought, Mosquito, carbon neutral?
Well, we didn't have any money to do anything with it when we bought it. So over the years, if the Rolling Stones had a hit, we'd build one house. If Janet Jackson had a hit, we'd build another house. If the Sex Pistols had a hit, we'd build another house. If Mike Oldfield had a hit, we built another one, and Genesis another one. And so over the years, we've created a beautiful island. And then, you know, I spend a lot of time on issues, global issues, and one of them is climate change, and therefore it's very important that we can set an example ourselves. And we have a big array of solar and you know, wind, and you know, we're almost self-sufficient on clean energy, and hopefully by the end of next year we'll be completely self-sufficient, and we're also trying to roll out to many islands throughout the Caribbean and help them become self-sufficient.
How many hurricanes have you been in?
I've been in one hurricane every 10 years. The first 3 were extraordinary, magnificent, beautiful. The seas were unbelievable, skies were unbelievable, the wind was unbelievable. But the damage was not, by and large, too bad. The last hurricane was anything but beautiful. I mean, it was effectively a Category 7 hurricane, over 200-mile-an-hour winds, and the damage was horrendous.
How at the time were you witnessing the severity of it?
I was with my team in a bunker under the main house. For 4.5 hours, we heard the screaming wind, and then sudden hush, and then we poked our head out of the door and saw the utter devastation that had happened in those first 4.5 hours. And then we realized that we were in the eye of the hurricane, and then the winds hit us from the other side, and then we threw ourselves back into the hurricane shelter for another 4.5 hours. And at the end of it all, I've never seen any devastation like it. You know, buildings that had literally disappeared, not one tree left standing. And what we were really worried about was, you know, next to us were all the people who worked on Necker Island in little, you know, wooden huts and things. And you know, later that day we went over there, and you know, people had lost their homes, and fortunately very little life was lost, I think, because it was a daytime storm. But the Caribbean people are so resilient, and they've just, you know, they rallied around, they've helped each other, and we've got a foundation there with Larry Page, and that's done a lot of good work there. My son's been great, and anyway, everybody, you know, just rallied around. I think one thing that this teaches us is the reason that the hurricane was so strong, and the strongest in history, was that the sea levels had never been so high and so hot at this time of year. So, and this is the big danger of climate change, is that as the sea gets hotter, the hurricanes are going to get more strong, and the damage is going to get stronger. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, we're working very, very hard trying to address climate change on a global basis, and we'll continue to do so.
So this has been about 5 years in the making. I never thought this would have happened, much less bumping into you in North Africa, only then to a month later be sitting down with you in the Bahamas. But thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Cheers.